Not by the authorities, but by the Beatles themselves.
The Beatles phenomenon was unstoppable. At the end of August, the single She Loves You became the fastest-selling record that had ever been released in the UK. In less than a year, the band's success outstripped that of any artist who had preceded them. And the final stage in their conquest of Britain came on November the 4th, 1963, when for the first time the Beatles came face to face with the highest order of the establishment, the royal family. The occasion unleashed the rock and roll rebel in John Lennon, who saw in the night's performance an opportunity too good to pass up.
John, in this royal variety show, when you're appearing before royalty, your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted Heath saying that he couldn't distinguish.
I can't understand
the Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
But you're not going to change your act just for the Lord Privy Seal.
Oh, no, like, we'll keep, like, the same kind of thing, like, won't we?
Oh, well, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Lennon always had an ambivalent relationship with how the establishment, the entertainment establishment, were cozying up to the Beatles. On the one hand, the professional in him loved the fact that they were being fantastically successful, but the rebel in him found it all hard to take. And so on the occasion of the Royal Command performance, he teased Brian Epstein by suggesting that he was going to go up and swear in front of the Queen. But in the end, his professionalism won out. He managed to create a little bit of subversion, but it was very carefully thought through.
For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. Would the people in the cheaper seats clap your hands? And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewellery.
This is sort of like a moment of insurrection, it felt like. But the thing is, it wasn't quite as radical, perhaps, because you look at Lennon's face after he says it, and he sort of looks as if he's just admitted to his mum that he's messed himself, or something like that. It was something really humble pie. You know, he felt quite sheepish. But no one else but John Lennon would really come out and even have the gall to say that. But what may have seemed a kind of a revolutionary, insurrectionary moment by saying, rattle your jewellery, in a really class-driven moment, was actually punctured by this sense that the Beatles were nice boys and they can get away with anything.
With the youth of Britain in their thrall, the Beatles headed out to new territories, travelling to Scandinavia at the close of the year and then on to France. The domestic pop scene that they left behind had been transformed by their success. And from Liverpudlian acts like Jerry and the Pacemakers to London's The Rolling Stones, new groups were emerging on an almost weekly basis to battle it out in the clubs and on the charts. The Beatles were moving on, however, with manager Brian Epstein's sights set firmly on the largest territory of all, America.
Looking forward to this American trip. Have you had any reaction over there? You got any fan clubs going? Is there
well, there's one supposed to be started, and they're getting quite good response, you know. Yeah. 12,000 letters a day.
But the Beatle movement's going over there.
Yeah,
Is it?
You can even be a Beatle booster, folks.
Yeah. I must tell you, by the way, that Detroit University have got to stamp out the Beatle movement.
No. Yeah, we've got to stamp out
Detroit. They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
There was always that thing, well, what happens next? Is the beat bubble going to burst, you know? Yeah. But it never did, it just kept going on.
If Britain was suffering a particularly harsh winter when the Beatles had first set the charts alight in early 1963, when their single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, reached America the following year, it entered a nation grappling with far greater misfortunes. Having emerged from the Second World War as one of the world's two superpowers, the following decade had been dominated by the country's hostile relationship with the Soviet Union and the threat of a full-blown nuclear war. But Americans themselves were enjoying the fruits of a flourishing economy. A strong consumer culture had developed, and domestic confidence was running high. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy came to office, a young, charismatic politician who embodied this new confidence and who promised a bright and optimistic future.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
3 years later, in November 1963, his assassination shook the country to its core.
There was this injection of energy into American life that he represented. You know, he was young, he was handsome. It represented such a marked change from Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, Eisenhower was a carryover from World War II. Obviously, he was a war hero. He was an extension of that generation into modern America. But John Kennedy was modern America. All of the optimism and youthfulness, the baby boom was going on, you know, was kind of epitomized by John Kennedy. And the Kennedy assassination just ended that. The Beatles represented also youth, just as John Kennedy did, and wit and intelligence. Certainly for young people, it turned things around immediately. The Beatles just lit America up.
I'm sure it could have been something else. I mean, I'm sure that some other joyful manifestation of something could have occurred. But what occurred was a song. And it's really important to realize in Britain, the Beatles' personalities, their repartee, their whole public performance was a critical part of the way that they came to the attention of the British public. In America, it was a song.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something. I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold.
It was the perfect vehicle to come into this traumatized national atmosphere. What is a dominant quality of the sound of John Lennon and Paul McCartney singing together? Joy. Joy in performance. Joy in listening to one another's voices. Joy in whatever kind of reinforcement is going on here. That's painting with really broad strokes. There's nothing subtle about that.
There is no question the Beatles changed everything immediately. And I Want to Hold Your Hand made a gigantic impact. And then, of course, I mean, the floodgates opened, and not only with one great Beatles song after another, but, you know, the British invasion. I mean, the Beatles just knocked the door down.
What the Beatles had done to Britain, they were now doing to America. Released at the close of 1963, within 2 months, I Want to Hold Your Hand had sold more than 1 million copies and became the band's first #1 single in the US. A week after they topped the charts, John, Paul, George and Ringo crossed the Atlantic and arrived in New York City to greet a new set of screaming teenage fans. They were also met by members of the press keen to understand this foreign phenomenon, and the group introduced them to their unique brand of informal humor, as rare in America as it had been in Britain.
There's no question that the way they dealt with the press was original. It was quite clear that they were not like anything else. How smart they really were, how funny they were. I mean, John and Paul in particular were extremely intelligent, articulate, original people. And George was also a very droll guy, and Ringo was sort of a natural clown who was just that quick, that smart, who was a pop star. I mean, I must be forgetting somebody, but damned if I can think of who it would be.
You think of your records as funny records? No, music, not
we think that it's funny and peculiar that they should be hits after such a long time.
Do you feel they're musical?
Obviously they're musical because it's music, isn't it? Our instruments make music, and it's a record, even
it's musical.
Classical. Musical.
It's music, isn't it?
That's music too.
It's good, he knows music up there.
All right, but what do you call it? Do you call it Boston rock and roll?
We don't. We try not to define it because we get so many wrong classifications of it. It's no use. We just call it music. So even if you don't.
With a question mark.
Pardon?
With a question mark.
No, we need
the
physics.
With an exclamation mark.
The underlying message of the Beatles' wit in their press conferences was about a youth movement. that wasn't going to be determined by old people. From the point of the Beatles' arrival, they completely reinvented how culture works. Before that, everything, fashion, movies, music, it all was top down. It all was, what grown-ups liked, and then it filtered down to the kids. After a year or two, suddenly it was young people who were determining everything. That started with the Beatles.
Having broken all previous sales records in Britain the year beforehand, by April 1964, the band made Billboard Hot 100 history by becoming the only act ever to occupy the first 5 positions on the chart. The 4 Mop Tops were now revolutionizing popular music in America too, and Beatlemania spread like wildfire throughout the country. And then, in July, following the time-honored career trajectory of all post-war popular entertainers, the band starred in their first full-length feature film. Yet A Hard Day's Night was, unsurprisingly, unlike anything that had preceded it.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night.
Music movies before A Hard Day's Night were profit-making ventures intended exclusively for the teen audience of whatever artists happened to be in them. A Hard Day's Night just kind of flipped that. They took what was a toss-off form, the rock movie, and made it something great.
Directed by American Richard Lester, the film created an entirely new language for rock and roll cinema. Previously, musicians had all made their transition to the big screen, playing fictional characters created by screenwriters. In A Hard Day's Night, however, the Beatles played themselves in a comedy inspired by their own experiences of fame. It was both a commercial and a critical phenomenon.
They're playing themselves in a sort of a fictional film. That didn't happen. So much of what happened in the early career of the Beatles hadn't really happened before. They were breaking through on so many different levels.
Tell me, how did you find America?
Turn left to Greenland.
Has success changed your life?
Yes.
I'd like to keep Britain tidy.
Are you a mod or a rocker?
No, I'm a mocker.
Oh. Have you any hobbies?
As I see it, it's really A Hard Day's Night that establishes them as something completely new and interesting beyond your wildest imaginings.
I don't snore. You do, repeatedly.
Do I snore, John?
Yeah, you're a window rattler, son.
It's just your opinion. Do I snore, Paul?
Well, a trombone hooter like yours would be unnatural if you didn't.
No, Paulie, don't mock the afflicted.
Oh, come off it. It's only a joke.
It may be a joke, but it's his nose. He can't help having a hideous great hooter. And the poor little head trembling under the weight of it.
This was not the rock and roll movie that you were expecting to see, not at all. And although their wit had always been clear, they were always funny on the microphone, its irreverence, and its irreverence about themselves, was just completely unprecedented. And of course, it just made them seem even more godlike.
And while the Beatles embarked on a substantial US tour in the summer of '64, back in Britain, the whole country was evolving in their wake. Following the sex scandals of the previous year, the nation had turned against the establishment and voted in the Labour government of new Prime Minister Harold Wilson, a man who seemed to represent the voice of a younger, more progressive United Kingdom.
Harold Wilson actually became leader of the Labour Party around the same time that the Beatles were just having the first stirrings of huge success. He was Northern, let's not forget that. So this was, again, part of this big Northern powerhouse. You had the Beatles on the popular culture sense, and then you had Harold Wilson, who was reflecting modernity in the political sense. We're thrusting into a new world. We were behind Europe in the 50s. The Tories had let us down. He wanted to, let's get modern, like the Italians, like the French, like the Germans, let's get working. And let's make everyone enjoy the fruits of the success.
And central to this new progressive Britain was its youth. The staggering international success of the homegrown pop scene had injected the younger generation with confidence. And boosted by the country's growing prosperity, a new consumer culture emerged. Fresh from the breeding grounds of the art colleges, the modern ideas of Britain's budding designers were unleashed. This was nowhere more apparent than in fashion and its nerve centre in London's bustling Carnaby Street.
This was the first time that young people had enough money to buy records, to buy clothes, to have their haircuts. Out of that, almost immediately came a separate youth market. Carnaby Street thrived. I mean, up until that point, when a girl left school, she immediately began dressing like her mother, whereas someone like Mary Quant made dresses that you could run in and you could dance in and do stuff, you know, that young people do. And of course, that transformed the whole face of British fashion.
Everything felt modern, new, fresh. Everywhere you looked, the world started to look different. The black and white of the early Beatles and pre-Beatles, even with the Beatles all in black and white, even Hard Day's Night was in black and white. Within a year, the colours started to really emerge, the green shoots of a new culture.
Although they had played the central role in cultivating this new cultural landscape, by late 1964, the Beatles themselves were growing weary of their 8 days a week fame. In an attempt to escape from Beatlemania, both John Lennon and George Harrison had moved to rural Surrey, 30 miles from the centre of London, and Ringo Starr would join them there the following year. In December, Beatles for Sale, the band's fourth studio album, was released, and it clearly showed signs of fatigue.
You only have to look at the cover. These are young men exhausted, really, by a couple of years of Beatlemania. It was just obvious that they were becoming worn out, and that the incredible appeal of early fame, which they just rode that like a wonderful wave, and you can see and feel the joy in the records and in the interviews. By Beatles for Sale, it's losing its luster quite quickly.
Yet the onward march of youth culture would soon revive the band. While the kaleidoscopic colours of Carnaby Street were in full bloom, a more experimental subculture was developing in West London, the leaders of which would soon cross paths with the Beatles. Inspired by avant-garde literature, art and music, this loose group of artists and artisans lacked a sense of community. In June 1965, however, Barry Miles, the manager of renowned independent bookshop Better Books, arranged a momentous poetry event at London's Albert Hall, featuring Allen Ginsberg and other leading American beat writers. It was of huge significance, uniting the various creative clans of an emerging British counterculture.
The big poetry reading at the Albert Hall in '65 was, I think, the first time a constituency was seen in London. Up until that point, the actors and the poets and the filmmakers and the people who ran boutiques, none of them knew each other. At this event, which was basically a Beat Generation reading of Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Gregory Corso, all of these people came together into the Albert Hall, 7,000 people. The whole thing was a giant party, and it was really like the first sort of mass networking session, I suppose.
At this pivotal event that he had helped organise, Miles met John Dunbar, an artist friendly with both Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso, and who had recently married young singer Marian Faithfull. Together, they planned a new centre for underground activities, the Indica Bookshop and Gallery, and this would bring Miles directly into the Beatles' world.
We went along to the Albert Hall, and a friend called Paolo Leone kind of went, "Oh, you should meet this guy," you know, who Miles worked at Better Books at that point. And so we got chatting, and I don't know how many people it holds, the Albert Hall, a couple of thousand, 5,000, I don't know. Anyway, we kind of thought, well, look, you know, everybody's paid £1 to see this, so maybe we could do a shop.
We decided to combine forces and start a bookshop art gallery combined. His best friend was a guy called Peter Asher, who at that point was in Peter and Gordon, a little rock and folk duo who had #1 hits, in fact, in Britain and America and Japan. And so Peter had some money, so naturally we looked to Peter to finance this venture. And so consequently, we started a company called Miles, Asher and Dunbar, MAD. I got to know Peter, of course, through this. And he was living at home with his parents. And also living at home was his sister, Jane Asher. Jane was a TV personality. She interviewed people. She was a child star in films and a lot on the radio. Also living there was Jane Asher's boyfriend, who was Paul McCartney, who was living on the top floor in a little attic room next to Peter's room. So there was this extraordinary household that I got introduced to. And when I was setting up the bookshop, we had all the books delivered to the basement there because we hadn't found any premises yet. And obviously through that, I got to know Paul as well. He would come in late at night, browse through the books and just leave me a note saying what he'd taken. So he was my first customer, in fact, in the bookshop. And when we did find some premises, he helped put up the shelves and paint the walls. So he was very, very involved with the whole project. And it was wonderful to get to know him.
While his bandmates had fled London in favour of the quiet suburban life, through his contact with the progressive art world, Paul McCartney soon became the most cultured of the Beatles. Where John Lennon had been married for years and was raising a young son, George Harrison had moved in with girlfriend Pattie Boyd, and Ringo Starr was a newlywed, McCartney was actively pursuing fresh sounds and fresh concepts, with Miles as his avant-garde guide.
In his own words, he used to go around London with his antenna out. One day he would go to see a John Cage concert or a Luciano Berio or some electronic music. And then next day he would go and see Tessie O'Shea at the Talk of the Town, or some torch singer down at the Blue Angel. I mean, it was all being sucked in.
McCartney was very much the culturally aware Beatle about town, while the others went into a slightly cozier existence in the stockbroker belt. He was still curious, he was still hungry for any stimulation. It's around this time, 1965, 66, that McCartney really begins to drive the Beatles. He hung around in London, being stimulated, and bringing all of that back to the Beatles' table, and continuing to give them, an artistic edge.
That artistic edge would prove unmistakable when the Beatles headed to the studio in mid-1965 to record the album Rubber Soul. Across the previous year, the wave of bands inspired by the Beatles' example had not only begun to catch up with the Liverpudlians, but in some cases threatened to overtake them. Following Lennon and McCartney's lead, the Rolling Stones had managed to break America and had begun to write their own hits. Folk icon Bob Dylan had gone electric and transformed into the preeminent poet of rock. And new bands were emerging, from The Who to The Byrds, introducing fresh sounds and perspectives. Yet the Beatles were ready to pave the way once again. In pursuit of total creative control, with Rubber Soul, producer George Martin booked the band into Abbey Road Studios for an entire month, turning conventional recording rules on their head.
Before Rubber Soul, a professional recording day was overseen by recording engineers in white coats, and there was 3 hours in the morning, a break for lunch, and 3 hours in the afternoon, and that was it. That was your recording day. When Rubber Soul came along, they had enough clout to say, we want a bit more flexibility than that. We might want to stay on and record into the night.
They invented the idea of treating a record album as if it were a work of art. It takes time to do anything that's worthwhile. So you had this new idea, the idea of the recording studio as compositional laboratory. This was this incredible, real revolution, not just how to make records, but how to make music.
There are places I remember.
Rubber Soul looks like the moment when pop music could become popular art. The whole album had a sense of being an artistic statement. Brian Wilson himself of the Beach Boys said, when I heard Rubber Soul, I knew that's how good pop records could be. They could be a whole artistic world. That's how good Rubber Soul was.
Is there anybody going to listen to my story? All about the girl who came to stay. She's the kind of girl you want so much it makes you sorry. Still you don't regret a single day. A girl
John Lennon is suddenly writing lyrics like, was she told when she was young that pain would lead to pleasure? Did she understand it when they said that a man must break his back to earn his day of leisure? Will she still believe it when he's dead? I mean, that's in a song called Girl. Those aren't pop song lyrics. That gave Rubber Soul just a very different feel.
You could hear that they were actually writing songs as artists, not just as pop performers. So you had songs like The Word, which is an extraordinary song for 1965. Say the word and that word is love. You know, this is 2 years before The Summer of Love. The despair of Beatles for sale, and there they are now reaching out for something that they've picked up on something else.
And just as Rubber Soul re-established the band's musical superiority, the four young Northern radicals were officially recognized by the British establishment. Having already received the highest accolades from the entertainment world, in October 1965, they were invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. Here they would be anointed as members of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or MBEs.
This has been one of the talents of the establishment for a very long time. In fact, this is what the MBEs and knighthoods and all sorts of things like that were all about. That at a certain point, renegades need to be brought into the fold. But it's at that very moment that they now, because they were always importing musical influences, but they also become a conduit for imported American influences in these other fields that they're getting interested in. Miles is turning them on to Ginsberg's poetry. Robert Fraser is turning them on to American pop artists, things like this. They become citizens of the world. And so it's perfectly appropriate that at that very moment, the British establishment should say, time for you to come to Buckingham Palace and be certified as representatives, as members of the British Empire.
John, had you met the Queen before?
No, first time.
What did she think of you in the flesh? Did she tell you?
No, she's not going to say either way, but she seemed pleasant enough to us, made us relaxed.
Oh, now you've got this, do you feel that you're becoming part of the establishment, as it's so called?
No, don't feel any different. I still feel just
exactly
like before.
Feel exactly the same. You feel exactly the same.
It was a recognition that the pop world had come of age. They were the aristocracy of the pop world, of pop culture, of working class culture. And so it was sort of inevitable in a way that they would be rewarded in the spirit of the new sort of democracy. But also it closed a chapter because from then on, they went off and did it their way, which wasn't the establishment's way. In fact, it was the beginning of a period of great antagonism with the establishment and pop culture. And the Beatles, as usual, were pretty much at the center of that.
The Beatles' position at the center of these new developments in youth culture was crucial to their evolution over the next 2 years. With McCartney now closely affiliated with key players in London's underground artistic scene, and with similar movements in both New York and Los Angeles influencing American musicians, the stage was now set for more radical ideas to enter the mainstream. And as these were developing, a new drug and a new figurehead were gaining prominence on both sides of the Atlantic.
The message is very simple. 6 words. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Psychologist Timothy Leary had emerged in the US as a prominent spokesman for the hallucinogen LSD, or acid. Having led psychedelic experiments at Harvard University since the turn of the 60s, and with beat poet Allen Ginsberg a key early supporter, by 1965, Leary was becoming a major countercultural figure.
Tim Leary was a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, psychotherapist. He claimed, I think, to have something like 7 PhDs. He was a professor at Harvard who began working originally with psilocybin before he got onto LSD as a way of treating prisoners and treating mental illness. I mean, the thing is, Leary was very much part of the establishment. He'd worked right across the normal lines of psychiatry. But of course, when he started to take all these things, he contacted his own self on a cellular level, and he realized that an awful lot of this was game playing and rubbish. And so he basically felt that this was in fact a spiritual key that he'd been handed, and that his message really should be to encourage people to leave the establishment and find themselves creatively or spiritually.
And the newly appointed MBEs, the Beatles, were already on their way to leaving the establishment and rediscovering themselves through hallucinogens. John Lennon and George Harrison had been introduced to LSD in early 1965 and had been joined by Ringo Starr for their second experience with the drug later that year. Combined with Paul McCartney's newfound interest in experimental art through his London social circle, the world's most commercial band were ready to take a very unexpected detour.
They wanted to discover who they were. They had no real sense of who they were, I think, anymore. So they're picking up the pieces, putting it together again. How the hell did they make sense of the Goldfish Bowl life that they'd been thrown into? From playing at the Casbah in Liverpool and the Cavern to being fated all around the world and just seeing themselves reflected back, people getting pieces of them everywhere, not knowing really who they were. And I think that was the engagement of pop culture, represented by the Beatles, with the counterculture, which was growing in confidence, and the fact that the two started to join forces in London, in San Francisco, they sparked off each other.